If I told you that one of the greatest entertainers in the 1800s was a preacher, you'd probably laugh. But in fact, Charles Spurgeon was said to be one of the greatest entertainers and revivalists of all time. While many may recognize his name, I bet you didn't know that he was one of Victoria, England's most controversial preachers. Not just for his beliefs, but also his theatrical sermons. In fact, it is said that no other form of entertainment in the 1800s could have compared to a sermon from Charles Spurgeon. Many may recognize his name, but I bet you didn't know that he was one of Victoria, England's most controversial preachers for being vulgar. In fact, Spurgeon once said, "I am perhaps vulgar, but it is not my intention, save that I must and I will make people listen. My firm conviction is that we've had enough polite preachers." His tenacious behavior behind the pulpit showed a fierce desire to reach people for Christ. It was this month in history, on May 3rd, 1850, a 15-year-old Charles Spurgeon made his public profession of faith in Jesus Christ. He preached his very first sermon at the age of 16 the following year and didn't stop preaching until his death 42 years later.
Charles Spurgeon was born in Essex, England, where his father and grandfather were ministers. Spurgeon recalled that he grew up with Pilgrim's Progress and Fox's Book of Martyrs on the shelves and frequently leafed through them to see the pictures inside. Even though his father was a minister, he broke away from the beliefs of his parents and decided to become a Baptist at age 15. He had, in fact, been struggling with his faith, alternating between searching for God and running away from the church. Then, one morning, a severe blizzard forced him from attending his own church and into the first church he could find, a primitive Methodist chapel started by the Wesley brothers. Spurgeon said of the man delivering the sermon that he was really stupid and could not even pronounce the words rightly, but somehow still caused Charles to look deeply into his own beliefs about salvation, including infant baptism. Even though he recalled the preacher as an imbecile, Spurgeon later said the preacher had looked directly at him and said, "Young man, you look very miserable. You always will be miserable in life and in death if you don't obey, but if you obey now, this moment, you will be saved." Spurgeon later wrote, "Between 10:30 when I entered that chapel and 12:30 when I returned home, what a change had taken place in me." Later, Spurgeon wrote, "That was the day he was saved."
After his conversion, Spurgeon searched for a congregation in line with his new beliefs. 4 months later, he was baptized and joined the Baptist church. His mother said that she had always prayed for him to find God, but didn't pray that he would become a Baptist. Although Spurgeon remained a Calvinist, he gladly took the name Baptist as well. According to Spurgeon, his belief was simple. It was Jesus Christ. Spurgeon began preaching in the rural town of Cambridgeshire, England. His energy and verbal mastery grew his congregation until his small church was bursting at the seams.
Spurgeon would use a simple outline and would speak extemporaneously. It was said that he had an amazing memory, and word got around about Spurgeon's fantastic preaching style. Many reports say that he had a great energy when he spoke, having a great tone and quality to his voice. His reputation was growing so fast that he was invited to preach at the historic New Park Street Chapel in London, England.
New Park Street Chapel was London's largest Baptist church. Although the congregants reportedly loved his preaching ability and wanted him to stay, they couldn't afford to pay him a salary. But Spurgeon enjoyed preaching there so much that it didn't matter. So he officially moved there and never looked back.
After 3 months ministering at New Park Street, the congregation was thriving, and they soon grew too large for the 1,200-seat auditorium. The church decided to enlarge the chapel in order to facilitate the meetings. While they were remodeling, the congregation met at a larger facility, Exeter Hall. The public auditorium seated 5,000 people, one of the largest auditoriums at the time. In 1855, the renovations at New Park Street were complete, but at that time, it was again too small for the growing church. In 1855, Spurgeon began publishing his sermons under the title The Penny Pulpit. Stenographers would sit in the congregation and write down his sermon as he preached it. The following day, Spurgeon would review the notes, make edits, and then make them available to print. These penny pulpit sermons were sold for a penny each and were widely circulated. Every year, the sermons would be gathered up and published in book form, called the New Park Street Pulpit.
Spurgeon quickly became known for his writings as well as his preachings. He went on to publish several other books, most notably Lectures to My Students and Treasury of David, a devotional commentary on Psalms. Spurgeon's Penny Pulpit series remained one of the best-selling sermon series of all time. The news of Charles's abilities continued to spread, and he was invited to speak at more and more locations throughout the nation, not just in London. Spurgeon went on to preach to tens of thousands in some of England's largest halls. It seemed no auditorium was ever large enough to hold the amount of people who wanted to listen. Rooms would fill to their maximum to hear the preaching sensation of London.
In 1861, his congregation, which kept constantly expanding, moved to the new Metropolitan Tabernacle, which seated 5,600, the largest church in London at the time. His ministry grew by leaps and bounds, resulting in the founding of 66 parachurch ministries. As his ministry grew in financial success, he continued to give more and more to the church. By the age of 27, Spurgeon had donated more than a third of the $3.6 million required for the construction of the Metropolitan Tabernacle himself. He didn't take a salary from the church, but earned money from the sale of his sermons and books.
His sermons and writings were such a success, the London Times and the New York Times began publishing his sermons. But not everybody was impressed. In fact, Spurgeon's worst critics were from within the church. Traditional Protestants criticized him for his dramatics on stage, pacing the platform and acting out stories. He was scorned for including sentiment in his preaching, including stories of dying children, grieving parents, and repentant harlots.
Those who took offense started calling him the Exeter Hall demagogue and the pulpit buffoon. In response, Spurgeon said, "I am perhaps vulgar, but it is not intentional. My firm conviction is that we have had enough polite preachers." People were also critical of his unapologetic evangelism. When people would question his creed, Spurgeon simply replied, "It is Jesus Christ." Perhaps the thing that made Spurgeon loved and hated was the way he spoke. He had the ability to make things simple. Reports say that he always spoke plainly. He tried to make the gospel simple, not some high society theological debate. Spurgeon insisted that we must not put the fodder on a high rack by our fine language, but use a great plainness of speech.
Mark? Nietzsche. Right? Is that how you say that? Nietzsche. Is it Nietzsche? Nietzsche? I thought it was Nietzsche. One notable sermon was on Acts 26:28, when he said, "Almost persuaded to be a Christian is like a man who is almost pardoned, but was hanged. Like the man who was almost rescued, but he was burned in the house. A man that is almost saved is damned." Spurgeon had serious conviction in his beliefs, which eventually caused quite the controversy.
In 1864, Spurgeon preached a sermon titled Baptismal Regeneration, which objected to Anglican teachings on the sacramental power of infant baptism. The transcribed version sold more than 350,000 copies. His outspoken attack on core Anglican theology caused a huge divide in the church. Spurgeon later decided to leave the Evangelical Alliance because of the falling out that ensued. Spurgeon was not afraid to take on controversial topics that he felt to be heretical.
Spurgeon publicly reprimanded other ministers for downgrading the faith during such a pivotal time in philosophical thought. Darwin had just published his book, origin of the species, and the idea of evolution was starting to spread. To make matters worse, Nietzsche was teaching that God was dead and to reconsider traditional faith and religion. This caused Christians all across Western civilization to reevaluate their beliefs. Spurgeon saw this tidal wave of secular thought sweeping Europe and warned church leaders of its consequences.
He advocated for the essentials of the faith and proclaimed them loudly. In his monthly publication, The Sword and the Trowel, Spurgeon said, "Our warfare is with men who are giving up on the atoning sacrifice, denying the inspiration of Holy Scripture, and casting slurs upon justification by faith." Watching people lose sight of the authority, inspiration, and inerrancy of the Bible broke Spurgeon's heart. As many believers began rejecting the resurrection of Christ, Spurgeon would not go silently. When the Baptist Union would not heed his advice to draft a statement of faith, he decided to resign from his position. When he resigned his post, he was censored by the denomination. Spurgeon, however, saw the future of a secular society and the ramifications for not standing up against it. He said, "I am quite willing to be eaten by dogs for the next 50 years, but the more distant future shall vindicate me." This prophetic statement certainly rings true today.